MotoGP is the premier form of motorcycle road racing in the modern age, and it traces its history all the way back to 1949. In that time, it's seen uncountable amounts of strange occurrences on and off the track. In my first MotoGP controversy iceberg, I covered a lot of these, most of the major ones that you've heard of. That was one of my favorite videos I've ever made. Researching all those stories, getting to relive some, and completely discover new ones was super fun, and I'm glad that I got to share them all with you. So, I'm making a sequel. Now, you don't have to have seen the first video to enjoy this one, as it's not like a direct follow-up. I'm just talking about different controversies and stories. They're not all controversial. Some of them are just important stories in MotoGP history. But if you think that there's maybe something missing, it's probably in the first video, and if it's not, leave it in the comments. I would love to keep making these. The actual iceberg structure of this video is going to be a little more loose, just because most of these are more obscure. Like almost all of these are more obscure than anything I talked about in the first video. So, you know, the structure is going to be a little bit looser, so don't be too hard on me for that, please. And as with the last video, all of the stories that include rider deaths are going to be at the end of the video together. So if you don't want to hear about that, which is understandable, I've put those all in one spot, and I'll let you know before we start talking about them. Lastly, you can see how long this video is. This took a lot of work from me, and I would really appreciate it if you would like and subscribe in order to push this content into the YouTube algorithm. Without further ado, let's get into the iceberg. Jorge Martin's Aprilia signing. Let's talk about some more recent drama in the paddock. Many people probably already know this story, but if you're new to MotoGP or you're watching this in the future, let me tell you about the Jorge Martin signing drama of 2024. So Ducati at the time was the most dominant manufacturer in MotoGP by a wide margin. Anyone not on a Ducati was punching way above their weight class, and they would go on to win 19 out of the 20 Grands Prix in the 2024 season. So mid-season, it was no surprise that they had some suitors for their factory seats. Let's run through the main contenders for the spots. First, the current members of the team, Francesco Bagnaia and Enea Bastianini. Bagnaia had won with the team in 2022 and 2023, and ahead of the 2024 season had extended his contract with the team until the end of 2026, so he was guaranteed to be one of the team's riders. Bastianini was a different story. His contract was up, and he was one of 3 main riders competing for the spots. The other 2 were championship contender Jorge Martin and Marc Marquez, who looked like he'd been bouncing back from the woes of his past few years. Jorge Martin was Bagnaia's main contender for the title in 2023 and was leading the championship in 2024. His dominance of the sprint category had a lot of people believing him to be the best rider on the grid. Ahead of the Italian Grand Prix, news broke that the Italian manufacturer was planning to give the seat to Jorge Martin, pairing up the title contenders and giving a factory spec bike to Marc Marquez on a satellite team. Marquez quickly took to the media and announced that it was a factory ride or nothing for him. The next news the public would hear regarding the situation was that Martin was signing with factory Aprilia. It turns out Ducati had promised the seat to Martin before telling him they would be going back on their word and giving the seat to Marquez instead. Apparently, after hearing this, Martin called his close friend Aleix Espargaro, who convinced him to take his spot at factory Aprilia, since he was retiring from full-time racing that year. Martin has since slammed Ducati multiple times in the media for the decision, but has also said that he'd be open to a future partnership. Marquez would go on to win 3 races in the 2024 season, but Martin would go on to be the champion. Did Ducati make the right call? I don't know, but it has to be said that if they had just sat down and talked with everyone, they may have been able to come up with a better and certainly much less messy solution to this problem. 2020 Yamaha Engines. It's audience participation time. If you had to guess which one of these 2 seasons was the winner in a championship, which one would you choose? It's probably this one, right? Well, you'd think, look at all those wins. But see, this is the 2020 Constructors' Championship. And in reality, Ducati won by 20 points. How is that possible? Well, to find out, we have to go back to the 2020 Catalan Grand Prix. Now, in case you forgot, 2020 was a weird year, and it was particularly weird for Yamaha in MotoGP. See, the start of the 2020 season saw the Qatar Grand Prix cancelled due to the pandemic, and most manufacturers seemingly thought this meant they would have more time to submit their engines for the year to the FIM. This was not the case, and the FIM reaffirmed the deadline was early March, a deadline which only Honda would meet. Yamaha eventually submitted an engine, and when they began ordering parts for the season, they learned that the supplier they had used for the valves in the test engine was not making the part anymore. So the Japanese factory looked for an identical part from a different supplier. They ran this new engine in the season opener in Jerez, and the parts experienced mechanical failures in 2 engines. See, the problem with this is that MotoGP engines are homologated. They need to be exactly the same throughout the whole season, and in order to get a change like this approved, you would need unanimous approval from every other manufacturer, something Yamaha did not get. To be fair to Yamaha though, they did not try and hide this. They were very open that they had done this, they just didn't go through the proper channels. The FIM began an investigation once this came to light and concluded that while the parts offered no inherent performance disadvantage, Yamaha could not confidently say they were identical parts due to differences in the materials used in the valves. This resulted in Yamaha being docked 50 whole points in the Constructors' Championship, and the teams were each deducted points based on how their riders had finished in Jerez. Crucially, the riders themselves were not docked any points in the Riders' Championship, which would have dramatically changed the landscape of the championship. Marc Marquez and Andrea Dovizioso both seemingly insinuated they believe riders should have been punished, but never directly said that, just that they believed the riders knew and that they didn't understand the ruling. In addition, Maverick Vinales had used all of his allotted engines for the year, a number which had come down after the Yamaha riders were banned from using the 2 engines run in Jerez, and as a result was ordered to start from pit lane during the European Grand Prix. Alex Rins commented that he thought Vinales should start every subsequent race from pit lane and not just the one, but this never came to fruition. All in all, it was a very serious technical regulations violation that ended up handing Ducati their 2nd Constructors' Championship. Darryn Binder takes out Dennis Foggia. Whenever a title contender is involved in an incident on the track, people love to talk about how it could be the deciding factor in the championship. About 90% of the time, it actually doesn't end up being the deciding factor. This falls into the other 10%. We find ourselves in the penultimate round of the 2021 Moto3 Championship. Coming into the Algarve Grand Prix, Dennis Foggia was Pedro Acosta's only remaining threat, with Foggia being 21 points behind the Shark in the standings. That's a sizable gap to make up, but not out of contention by any means. And during the race, Foggia would do his best to keep himself in contention. On the very last lap of the race, Foggia led Acosta into turn 3, enough to cut 5 points out of the lead. Acosta passed him on the inside, and immediately after, Darryn Binder, bound for MotoGP the following year, would come in with far too much speed and slam into Foggia, wiping him out of both the race and championship contention after Acosta went on to win. Binder attempted to apologize to Foggia after the race, but was faced with demands to leave from the Leopard Honda team. When asked about this later, the team would respond with, quote, "We didn't want Darryn Binder's presence at the box because it is obvious that after deciding Dennis Foggia's chances in the fight for the championship, it should be reasonable to think that moment wasn't the right one." End quote. Darryn Binder has thrown away all the effort and hard work of our team this year. It wasn't just a race incident. Thanks for understanding it. The most important thing is that Dennis Foggia is fine after the crash. Dennis Foggia would later go on to give an interview where he, in a polite, media-friendly way, basically insinuated that he felt that Darryn Binder shouldn't be promoted to MotoGP while he was making such reckless moves. 2014 German Grand Prix. Dry races are easy. Wet races aren't that bad. It's when the weather is unpredictable that things get weird. It was raining prior to race start, but just before the race was due to start, it began to slow and eventually stopped, leading some riders to switch to slicks, but most were still on wet tires, not believing that the track would dry fast enough to really make a difference. On the warm-up lap, many riders realized that the track was drying a lot more rapidly than they had expected, and a vast majority of riders elected to pull into the pits at the end of the formation lap to swap to dry tires. All of these riders were now forced to start from pit lane, which meant the starting grid looked like this, with Stefan Bradl being the only rider on the first 5 rows. As far as I can tell, this is the smallest starting grid in modern MotoGP history, with many of the riders near the back electing to take a risk and go out on wets ahead of the other riders to try and gain an advantage. Only Bradl, Aoyama, and Abraham were left on the grid with slick tires. Just appreciate this pit lane start. It might be the only one we ever see like it. The start looks like the videos of when they're herding sheep and they herd them through like the gate and they all like clamber together. That's what this always reminded me of. During the race, Bradl streaked away ahead of the other grid starters, and Marc Marquez began to streak away from the pit lane starters. Eventually, as the track fully dried, the pit lane starters would catch and pass the grid starters, and meanwhile, Stefan Bradl was struggling, even though he had qualified third. The reason for this is that while all of the other riders had completely swapped from a wet to dry race setup, Bradl had only changed his tires, meaning that the rest of his bike was still set up for a wet weather race, and he wasn't able to perform as well as he otherwise could have. He would fall to 16th, barely coming outside the points. My goat is washed. 2012 San Marino Grand Prix. Dani Pedrosa is widely considered the best rider to never win a Premier Class world title, but in 2012, he came damn close. He was on fire in the second half of that season, winning 6 of the last 8 Grands Prix. If he had finished second or higher in either of those 2 races, he would have been world champion over Jorge Lorenzo. The first of those 2 races was the San Marino Grand Prix. Dani Pedrosa qualified on pole, ready to win a 3rd consecutive race. On the first attempt to start, a malfunction with the lights would cause the race to be delayed. During this time, Pedrosa would experience a technical problem with his bike. This caused his team to wheel it just barely into pit lane, but this was enough to force him to start the race from the back of the grid. Dani Pedrosa made good progress on lap 1, climbing to 11th place at the end of sector 1, the end of the first sector, for like 4 turns in Misano. 5 turns? A few turns in Misano. Regardless, it wouldn't matter, as an ill-advised pass from Hector Barbera would send him flying into the gravel. On Twitter, Barbera would say, quote, "First of all, I want to apologize to Dani, who is fighting for the championship. I'm very sorry, but it was a set of circumstances. He overtook Randy and me under braking on the outside. I was parallel with Randy, and suddenly Dani dove for the corner. Neither Randy or me had that line. I couldn't go to the outside because Randy was there, and on the inside Dani had closed the gap. There was nothing I could do. It's obvious that I wasn't trying to pass him, that's clear. It was just that I had Randy on the outside and Dani on the inside with a line that was tighter than ours. I couldn't avoid him. I can only say it's a racing incident and probably with the wrong rider. I'm very sorry for him, but it is not his or my fault, it's just a racing incident. A lot of coincidences together." Without this crash, it is unlikely but possible that he could have gotten the 2nd place he needed to win the championship that year. Sadly, this incident was just another in a long line of incidents throughout Pedrosa's career that kept him from ever winning a world championship. If you want to hear more, Absolute Dan has a great video on the subject. The 1998 Argentine Grand Prix. 1993 250cc champion Tetsuya Harada was putting on another strong championship campaign in 1998, looking as good as he ever had with 5 wins and 8 podiums. His main rival was Loris Capirossi, with a less immediate threat from a 250 rookie, Valentino Rossi, who had won the last 3 races in a row leading up to the final round. All 3 were Aprilia riders, and throughout the whole season, all 3 of them were convinced that the other 2 were getting better parts than them, so things were pretty contentious. Capirossi had barely eked out an advantage prior to the final round, leading Harada 204 to 200 in the point standings prior to the race. And the top 3 in the championship were the top 3 in the race by the last lap. Rossi had a comfortable lead, with Capirossi and Harada fighting for second behind him. Harada had the win and the championship in sight heading into the final corner, when out of nowhere, Capirossi would slam into Harada after an insanely dangerous pass. Capirossi would stay on and finish in second, enough to make him world champion. The FIM initially disqualified Capirossi for irresponsible riding, although this didn't really matter, as he would have still won the championship regardless since Harada hadn't finished the race. He still filed an appeal with the International Disciplinary Court, who decided that while he had ridden irresponsibly, he had not intentionally knocked Harada off the bike, and his results were reinstated. And that's what the record shows today. Aprilia was upset though, and they broke off Capirossi's contract early, sending him packing for 1999. He found a home with Honda, where he would finish 3rd in the championship. Capirossi would take Aprilia to court over the contract dispute and would end up winning $2 million, with which he allegedly bought a Ferrari and put Aprilia on the license plate, which is really funny actually. Reopening Misano. Misano has been a mainstay in MotoGP for nearly 2 decades now, and has often been the site of double races when needed. Many fans who don't know the history of the sport might think it's always been this way, but that's not the case. In fact, there was a time not too long ago where a portion of fans thought that Misano should never be on the calendar again. Why is that? Well, It's because of Wayne Rainey. Wayne Rainey was a beloved American rider who competed in the late 80s and early 90s at the height of the two-stroke era. He had secured a three-peat of Riders' Championships riding under Kenny Roberts in 1990, 1991, and 1992, and was competing hard for a fourth in 1993. But sadly, at the Italian Grand Prix, he would suffer a terrible accident, and, coupled with a pre-existing back injury from a prior crash, he would end up paralyzed from the waist down, prematurely ending one of the greatest careers the sport had ever seen. The FIM removed the circuit from the calendar, presumably in his honor. But in the early 2000s, MotoGP had a dilemma. The sport had seen the rise of its biggest modern superstar, Valentino Rossi. Now you may not know this, but Valentino Rossi is Italian, and he had brought with him waves of Italian fans to support MotoGP. But they only had a single Italian race on the calendar. So what should they do? Well, easy. Reopen Misano, but run it backwards, making it technically a different track. That's how that works, right? This results in some less than ideal racing, as the track is now backwards from the way it was designed. Ironically enough, Wayne Rainey loved the original Misano. It was one of his favorite tracks, and since it was run anti-clockwise, he loved it because of his dirt tracking background. It's a very interesting example of when MotoGP's love and respect for its history comes into conflict with the modern financial implications of a worldwide sport. Anthony West doping bans. So those of you who don't spend your free time looking up MotoGP rider statistics like normal people may have never come across this. But on a rider's Wikipedia page, there's these nice little tables that have a rider's complete career statistics. Shout out to the people who make these, by the way. You've made my life so much easier than it otherwise would be. Anyway, if you've ever gotten curious about the Australian rider Anthony West, you may have seen this. What happened here? Well, I expected it to be similar to the story of Andrea Iannone, a simple case of retroactive race results being annulled due to a doping ban. But the rabbit hole here goes way deeper than I thought it would, so buckle in for the story of Ant West versus the FIM. Let's start with this initial ban, the one that nullified his results from the 2012 and 2013 Moto2 season. Sometime after the 2012 French Grand Prix, West tested positive for a substance called methylhexanamine. Now, that sounds really bad. It has the no-no word right in front of it. But in reality, it would only really provide as much of an advantage as, say, caffeine, a stimulant which has similar effects. But it is used in energy drinks and bodybuilding supplements, which is how West alleged it got into his system. So the FIM issued him a 30-day ban. Honestly, maybe even this was a little harsh in my opinion, but rules are rules. Now those of you who are really using your noggin may have noticed that all of these races did not happen in a 30-day span. So what gives? Well, the World Anti-Doping Association appealed the FIM for a harsher sentence, asking West be suspended for a full 2 years. The case went before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, who decided to partially uphold the sentence. They felt the request from the WADA was a little harsh, so they handed West an 18-month suspension, and said that it started the moment that the 2012 French Grand Prix happened. So this meant that his races were retroactively nullified, instead of having to sit out for another 18 months. The results that were stricken included 2 second-place finishes. Things were fine for West until 2018, when the WADA came out with a new report saying he had tested positive for an unnamed stimulant. Anthony West at the time was competing in World Supersport and was banned from competing in FIM events for 18 months once more. Now, since they never really said what the stimulant was that he tested positive for, who knows if this ban was fair or not. What certainly wasn't fair was when West's ban was extended by a further 6 months after competing in a Brazilian Superbike National Championship, which was not governed by the FIM. West was infuriated, and in a post on Facebook would go on to accuse the FIM of making up arbitrary rules to benefit their stars and hurt the little guys, accusing Marc Marquez of using a modified ECU to win his Moto2 title, and claiming Valentino Rossi only won his 500cc championship through the use of special-made tires. He finished the post by saying, quote, "I'm so fucking angry. I have 100 other stories like this. I give up. I planned on coming back to racing in September, but I can't take this shit from the FIM anymore. It's destroyed my life to the point I wish I was dead. I hate life. Fuck you again, FIM." However, at the end of his ban period, he would apologize for his comments and return to racing in the Australian Superbike Championship. 2017 French Moto3 Grand Prix. This Grand Prix was home to one of the strangest sights in Grand Prix racing history. Usually, the biggest pileups in motorcycle racing are limited to 5 or 6 riders, and even those are usually limited to the start of the race. This incident didn't have 6 riders, didn't have 7 riders, not even 8 or 9. No, this incident had 17 riders crash by my count. I say by my count because the race report just gives up. They just say race stopped due to multiple riders crashing. They don't even bother to list everyone. On the second lap, as the riders descended down La Chapelle, riders began to fall. Just look at them. They all go down one by one, sliding into the gravel. These weren't bad riders either. Maria Herrera, Nicolo Bulega, Jorge Martin, Joan Mir, and Enea Bastianini were all caught out. The odds of riders of this caliber and a dozen more all making this mistake at the same time in the same corner are billions to one. Well, this wasn't the only incident at the French Moto3 Grand Prix. At the very start of the race, a 4-rider incident occurred right after the Dunlop chicane. Of these 4, Jakob Kornfeil was the only one to remount, unaware that his bike was leaking oil all the way down La Chapelle, and when the field came around the next lap, it was already too late. Nicolo Bulega, Nicolo Antonelli, and Joan Mir were all hit by bikes and taken to the medical center, but were cleared to participate in the restart of the race, the first race having been, of course, red flagged. Now, after the fact, Kornfeil's team insisted that his bike was only leaking water and not oil, but that oil had to come from somewhere, and nobody else who crashed, take it however you will. It is one of the most insane incidents in Grand Prix racing history. Paul Bird Motorsports drug smuggling. Okay, admittedly, this one doesn't have to do very much with MotoGP, but the name MotoGP shows up a lot in the headlines related to this story, and it's kind of just too juicy to not cover. One of the craziest stories to come out of motorcycle racing in the past decade is the drug smuggling antics of the Paul Bird Motorsports team. Paul Bird owned Paul Bird Motorsport, go figure, which competed in Moto2 in 2012 with James Ellison and in MotoGP in 2014 with Brock Parks and Michael Laverty. Alright, there's the flimsy MotoGP connection I needed to shoehorn this into the video. Now for the controversy. In 2011, while the team was focused on World Superbike, one of their drivers was arrested at Dover, when it was found that contained alongside the racing equipment was 6 kilos of cocaine, 68 kilos of cannabis resin, and 30 kilos of ecstasy tablets, as well as a handgun and ammunition. Paul Bird himself would deny allegations of anything, saying he knew nothing, and claim the drugs were planted by drug smuggling gangs. On a completely unrelated note, Paul Bird would be banned from organized sport in 2015 after testing positive for cocaine. Earlier this year, the driver was sentenced to 18 years in prison for drug smuggling. Don't smuggle drugs, kids, especially across international borders. Well, no, don't do it, period, but like, you know what I mean. I actually do think those two things are unrelated, by the way, like Paul Bird doing drugs and his team smuggling drugs. Those are two very different things to engage in. It was just funny to say it like that. 2010 Phillip Island Moto2. I talked about this incident briefly in my Moto2 Black Flags video, but let's look at it with a little bit more depth. First, let's take a look at our main character, Wayne Maxwell. Maxwell would go on to win 3 Australian Superbike Championships and an Australasian Superbike Championship. He is a great rider, and by all accounts I found while looking through this, he is normally a great guy, and what I'm about to tell you is extremely out of character for him. In 2010, Maxwell secured a one-off ride in Moto2 at his home race in Phillip Island, something the talented Australian would later describe as, quote, probably the highlight of my career so far. Unfortunately, Maxwell was left off the highlight reel for all the wrong reasons in this race. After impressing in qualifying and making it to the 3rd row in 11th place, his race would start in the worst way possible, being taken out by Hector Fauble in Siberia on the very first lap. He would rejoin at the back of the pack and sometime later be issued a black flag disqualifying from the race. Initially on the broadcast, a reason was not given for the black flag, but after Maxwell had pulled into the pits, they showed a partial replay of him pushing Fauble to the ground after the incident. This, however, is not the full story. Luckily, we have this video from a fan in the stands that shows Maxwell charging at and wailing on Fauble. His anger here is understandable. He was an upcoming talent and finally got a chance at his best track, a track where he had set MotoGP level times on a superbike, and he got taken out on lap 1. That being said, he undeniably took it way too far here. The incident earned Maxwell a €5,000 fine, and while it's impossible to say that this is why he never got another Grand Prix invitation, it certainly didn't help his chances. The 2003 Dutch TT. The 2003 Dutch TT is another race that had some weird stuff happen because of the weather. The weather seemed wet leading up to the start of the race, but just under 15 minutes from the start, it was declared dry by the race officials, leading many riders to switch to slick tires meant for dry weather. The riders started their warm-up lap and rain began to fall. Meanwhile, the pole sitter Loris Capirossi was still in the pits after a tire change and started the warm-up lap from there, leading to questions about where he would start the race from. Valentino Rossi would put his hand up on the warm-up lap and lead a large group of riders into the pits, where they would change back onto wet tires. The race was delayed and eventually began as normal, although Nobuatsu Aoki and Jeremy McWilliams were forced to start from pit lane due to not making the starting grid on time. The rain would intensify and over the course of the race would become nothing less than torrential, but it would proceed without stoppage, which some fans and riders would later call into question. Eventually, Sete Gibernau would be victorious in the Dutch rain. 1965, Isle of Man TT. Mike Hailwood was one of the best Isle of Man TT riders of all time, winning a total of 14 TTs, most of which during the Grand Prix era of the event, and winning again after an 11-year absence from the race. He's currently 6th of all time in total TT wins, and he held the record for the most TT victories until 1993, 14 years after he contested his last race on the mountain road. While his greatness on the Isle is undeniable, one of these races was won under some dubious circumstances. In 1965, Hailwood was competing in the Senior TT for MV Augusta. He had already crashed out of the 350cc race earlier that day, and when he had a crash in the 500cc race at Sarah's Cottage, which, incidentally, the same place his teammate, a rookie Giacomo Agostini, had crashed just a couple laps earlier, Hailwood's bike was in rough shape after the crash. A broken windscreen, flattened exhaust megaphones, and bent handlebars wouldn't stop Mike the bike though, and he would kick the clip-ons back into place, hop on his MV, and he would ride down a hill in order to get the bike started again. It was probably this hill on the screen, but I can't be 100% sure. He would then turn around, ride back up that hill, and continue on. He would go into the pits, wipe off his bloody nose, straighten out his handlebars, and go on to amazingly win the race. Crash and all. An incredible performance by any metric. There's just one problem though. That was illegal. In the process of restarting his bike, he had gone against the direction of racing, which is strictly forbidden for safety reasons. As far as I can tell, he was allowed to keep the win because no one snitched. Just no one who saw the crash said anything. Those are some spectators you can trust. In all seriousness, this is one of the only verifiable accounts of someone cheating in a Grand Prix and just getting away with it, being allowed to keep the result, which is crazy, and even crazier that it was a win in the Isle of Man. Absolutely wild. 1992 Brazil Rider Strike. The 1992 Brazilian Grand Prix was meant to be the penultimate round of the season, and it was to be held at Interlagos, a track primarily known for hosting F1 at the time. It had never hosted a motorcycle race before. Thus, many of the riders didn't know what to expect when they showed up, and what they found appalled them. A flat-out 6-gear kinked corner with a concrete wall lining it, and a track that may have been smooth enough for 4 wheels, but was way too rough and bumpy for a motorcycle race. This would become the catalyst for a rider's strike. Well, surely someone at the FIM had vetted the track beforehand, right? Well, actually, they had considered putting Interlagos on the calendar a year prior in 1991. And the International Motorcycle Racers Association, a union formed and headed by Wayne Rainey, had sent out Kevin Schwantz to personally inspect the track. He had told the locals that there was no possible way they could race there, so it was out for 91. In 92, the race organizers attempted to get the track okayed again, and an FIM representative, IRTA boss Paul Butler, and another IMRA member, Didier de Rodrigues, were all sent out to inspect the track. It genuinely seems like no one knows why these three gave the track the all clear, but they did. And now we're all caught up. And there's a group of livid motorcycle racers sitting in a Dorna office above pit lane, trying to decide what was to be done. Riders were split on what to do. Wayne Rainey was ready to ride, saying they had no reason not to since their IRMA rep had given the okay. This made sense. Rainey had formed the IMRA, and likely wanted to prove that it was a united front for the riders. Some of Rainey's fellow riders, however, believed that he had some ulterior motives. He was second in the 1992 World Championship standings, right behind Mick Doohan. Doohan had gotten off to an incredible start that season, winning 5 of the first 7 races and coming in second in 2 others, before a horrific crash in the Netherlands had left him out of the majority of the season. In the meantime, Rainey had mounted a charge, but even with the Australian missing 4 rounds, Rainey was still 22 points behind. The maximum points available in a race at the time was 20. If Rainey wanted to be champion, he needed this race, and everyone knew it. Eddie Lawson was convinced Wayne Rainey was putting his own interests over the safety of his fellow riders, and so he stormed out of the meeting, promising to do whatever the other riders didn't. When Saturday morning came and FP3 started, just like he said, Lawson was the only rider revving his engine, and he took off for practice. Doohan would also decide to race. And after that, it was all over. Rainey couldn't very well just let Doohan race and not compete. The strike fell apart. Doohan, for his part, could hardly walk and appeared sickly and weak all weekend. He managed a measly 12th place, the only time in his career he finished outside the points. Rainey would finish on the podium, and a win in South Africa would secure him his third and final world championship. If this strike had gone through though, Rainey would be a 2-time world champion and Doohan would have 6 world titles instead of 5. The 2006 Catalan Grand Prix. The 2006 Grand Prix de Barcelona Catalunya was home to a series of confusing race starts that left one rider with a potentially controversial ending to his weekend. On the initial start, some drama would occur before even the first corner. Sete Gibernau would make contact with Ducati teammate Loris Capirossi, hitting his front brake lever and causing one of the most visually spectacular crashes in MotoGP history, with his Ducati going end over end down the front straight. Marco Melandri, Danny Pedrosa, John Hopkins, and Randy DePunier would also be taken out as a result of the contact. This crash would bring out a red flag, and the race would be restarted after riders had been checked by medics and debris had been cleared. Gibernau suffered a fractured collarbone, and Capirossi sustained multiple chest injuries. Marco Melandri had dislocated his collarbone. An interesting side note to this is that Gibernau would end up being taken to a hospital for further examinations, and on his way to the hospital, his ambulance crashed. His ambulance got into a car accident. He was fine. There was no injuries in the accident. It was very minor, but just getting into a car crash in an ambulance is... what a visual. Eventually, the pit lane was reopened and riders took to the grid again. As the riders came around after their warm-up lap, Christopher Mullen began to signal something wrong with his machine. He wheeled the bike off to the side of the grid and a crew member came out to help him, and Race Direction made the decision to fully delay the start again and run another warm-up lap, which is weird. I feel like they don't usually do that for a single rider having a problem. During the third starting lineup, Shinya Nakano's bike was wheeled off the grid. According to Nakano, while Vermeulen's incident was being sorted, his bike overheated and sprayed water onto his screen, so he swapped bikes. He claims someone waved him back onto the grid, so he took his original position. However, he was issued a jump start penalty, which, based on an interview shortly after the race, he believes was not an actual jump start penalty, but from starting the grid illegally instead of from pit lane, which would eventually lead to a black flag when he did not serve the jump start penalty. All around, a weird scenario for a weird race. The 1971 Ulster Grand Prix. The Ulster Grand Prix is a road racing event held in Ulster. Groundbreaking, I know. Ulster itself is a province of Ireland with 3 counties in the Republic of Ireland and 6 in Northern Ireland. This is important, I promise. It is still run today as an independent road race event similar to that of the Isle of Man, although it has failed to be run since the pandemic due to various financial issues. However, from 1949 to 1971, it was a mainstay in the Motorcycle Grand Prix World Championship. During the 70s, safety concerns surrounding the presence of these closed road circuits on the calendar began to arise, and some riders began to boycott them. One of the first notable incidents was in 1971 when Giacomo Agostini just didn't show up to Ulster. His bikes got there just fine, he just wasn't there to ride them. Now this might be for a few different factors. First is the weather. The 1971 Ulster Grand Prix was held in torrential rain, with race organizers refusing to make any changes. But a much more likely culprit were the mounting tensions and civil unrest in Ireland at the time. The conflict itself is not the focus of the video, and I don't know nearly enough about it, but what is important is that at the time, bombings and shootings were common in Belfast, which was the next city over from where the Grand Prix was to be held. Now, the race organizers should have cancelled. This was not the time or place for this Grand Prix to happen. The race organizers, however, insisted that it was perfectly safe. This is probably just to avoid the cancellation fee they would have had to pay to the FIM for cancelling the Grand Prix. The race itself was fairly normal. The organizers did swap the race order, having the 350s run before the 250s because they expected the 250s to be more exciting, which is weird but not terrible, especially back then when race organization was just a little looser. The torrential rain also probably should have stopped the race, but miraculously, as far as I can tell, there were no serious injuries because of it. But the following year, the problems became unignorable, as a bomb planted in the Grand Prix house left it in ruins, and the organizers finally decided that the time was right to cancel the Grand Prix, making this probably the only race ever canceled due to a bombing in MotoGP or Grand Prix racing history. By the time tensions in the area had settled down, riders were beyond ready to move on from street races, and so Ulster just never came back onto the calendar. Walter Migliorati. Okay, Walter Migliorati was never involved in a major controversy as far as I can tell. He never won a Grand Prix, much less a World Championship. So why is he here? Well, I'll be honest, I just had to talk about this guy somehow. He is crazy. Migliorati raced in the 1980s, an era defined by rock stars, bad boys, bad hair, and copious amounts of Coca-Cola. And even then, he was a little strange. But I want you to take a step back and listen to what I'm about to tell you, and imagine that he was a rider on the grid today. Because it's hilarious. It's hilarious to think about what would happen if a rider did all this stuff today. Grand Prix motorcycle racing is a superstitious world. Jorge Martin has his paddock exit ritual, which is similar to Valentino Rossi's paddock exit ritual, which is one of many rituals that the Doctor had. And in the 1980s, things were no different. Marco Lucanelli, another crazy rider from the 80s who probably deserves his own video, always wore a tie under his leathers. Guido Paci wore his lucky socks, which allegedly were never washed, in every single race. Walter Migliorati had a different kind of ritual. He would take the undergarments of whatever woman he could find and wear them over his head under his helmet. Yes, really. See, Migliorati was particularly fond of female company, openly confessing to scouting women looking for autographs or holding umbrellas at the races who he could show to his hotel room later. Now, MotoGP in this era had no shortage of rock stars and playboys. We know about Marco Lucanelli, and there's a whole list of insane stuff that Barry Sheene did. But seriously, the thought of a rider on today's grid wearing a pair of panties on his head under his helmet every race, I think Dorna would lose their minds. The 1983 French Grand Prix. We talked about the 1983 French Grand Prix and the tragedies that surrounded the Premier class that day in the first Iceberg video. But instead, I want to share with you a story of triumph from the 250cc class. For most of these, I gathered information from multiple sources, but almost all the information in this one comes from an article by Matt Oxley, which is linked in the description below. It is a wonderful read, and I highly recommend it. But fair warning, the story of Carter's life as a whole is a fair bit darker than the story I'm telling you today, so be prepared if you choose to read further. Our main character today is Alan Carter, an 18-year-old privateer rider for Team Mitsui Yamaha. If you watched the first video and you're this far into this one, by this point it should be pretty clear that non-factory riders were not nearly as well off as factory-supported riders, especially back then. And it showed. Carter qualified dead last in this race, 31st of 31 on the grid. He would be starting over 100 meters behind pole sitter Christian Serron. He went back to his paddock thinking there was zero hope. Critically, it was a very cold weekend at Le Mans, and the new 1983 Dunlop tires were all way too hard for any of them to be effective. This left the entire grid equally disadvantaged. That was until Carter's mechanic found a 1982 super soft Dunlop slick in the back of a truck. The team got unfathomably lucky, and soon enough Dunlop heard about it and tried to force the young rider to give it up for one of their factory guys. But Carter's dad told them all to shove it, as his son would be racing with the tire instead. As the race started, Carter began climbing. Halfway through the race, he was in the top 10. Cito Pons and reigning world champion Jean-Louis Tournaud would crash out ahead of him, and he would pass Thierry Rapico at the end just as snow started to fall. Because of his line choice, he couldn't see his pit board, so he had no idea what position he was in, but he was pretty sure it was good enough for a podium. After the race, he entered the pits, and was informed by a reporter, to his shock and joy, that he had just won the French Grand Prix. Carter had become the youngest rider to ever win an intermediate class Grand Prix, and secured a Marlboro Yamaha ride for the next year. 1989 Belgian Grand Prix. Bernie Eccleston just cannot stop fucking with the Belgian Grand Prix, can he? Last time we discussed how he killed the race forever, preventing it from returning to the calendar by driving up ticket prices through shady deals. Now we get to talk about more of his shady dealings from 1989, which actually ended up leading to the creation of dry and wet race rules. When racing fans around the world received their magazines, they saw photos from the 1989 Belgian Grand Prix. These photos showed Kevin Schwantz standing atop the podium at the end of the scheduled 18 laps. The results were entered into the books differently. A victory for Eddie Lawson after just 8 laps completed. What the hell? So how is this possible? Well, the race started as normal, with Lawson, Rainey, and Schwantz leading, but soon rain falls and wet patches begin appearing. The riders raise their hands and signal a stop, coming into the pits after 5 laps. The organizers wait for the rain to clear, and a dry restart is scheduled. The riders line up, and again it's Lawson, Rainey, and Schwantz out front, although after just 4 more laps, rain falls again, and the race is stopped for a second time after 8 completed laps. Per FIM regulations at the time, this was the end of the race. Only 1 race restart was allowed, and aggregate times were to be used to calculate the final standings. His director, however, feared a riot would occur if he sent fans home after just 8 laps. This is where he was given a wonderful idea by a particular race promoter. Send the riders out again. FIM rules be damned. A third leg of the race is to be run in the wet, the riders are told, so they line up again. This time Rainey and Schwantz pull away like before, but Lawson gets into a scrap with John Kosinski for third, keeping him behind the other 2. Interestingly, Schwantz crashed out on the last lap of this final leg. Why is he on the top of the podium in the magazine photos? Who the hell knows? This race doesn't make any sense anyway. The FIM heard about this soon after and realized something had to be done. They decided that they would award half points for the first 2 legs of the race. Soon after, the first set of wet race, dry race rules were instituted. The rule stated that a race must be declared wet or dry. If a race is started dry and a race is red flagged due to the rain, there will be a maximum of 1 restart, which will automatically be declared wet. And if a rider makes the wrong tire choice for that race, well, they'll just have to deal with it or come in for a change. This was later overridden by flag-to-flag rules once TV coverage became a priority, but that's a story for another time. The 1989 Italian Grand Prix Riders' Strike. While the riders had failed to organize properly for a Brazil strike in '92, 3 years prior, they had executed one successfully. The scene this time was the 1989 Nations Grand Prix, a race scheduled to be held in Misano. When the riders arrived, they found a racetrack that had become incredibly slippery when rain fell. They told announcers they wouldn't race if it began to rain. Sure enough, on Sunday, a few laps into the 500cc race, rain began to fall, and Kevin Schwantz led the whole field into the pits. Riders fought with race organizers and their teams for an hour, trying to hold a united front. In the end, the top riders resorted to locking themselves in Randy Mamola's motorhome. And Rainey, Lawson, Doohan, Schwantz, Gardner, Saran, McGee, McKensley, Haslam, and McElnay, all the top riders, refused to ride. The only star who rode was Pier Francesco Chili. A local Honda rider, he was forced to ride by his team. The promoters refused to cancel the race, and it went forward with Chili leading privateers around the track. The top riders all stood at the side of the track once the race restarted, yelling and cursing at the scabs when they rode by. Chili won the race easily. He was leading a bunch of privateers on a factory bike. But on the podium, he broke down in tears, knowing he had become the scab of the paddock. The strikers were happy with the results of the strike. Sticking it to the promoters and the FIM was a huge win for the riders at this time, and knowing that they had held a united front and ruined the FIM's event, they felt confident that they could improve safety regulations in the future, which eventually they would. Alright, from now on is the section of the video where I'll be covering rider deaths. If you don't want to hear about that, click away now. Maybe go watch the first Iceberg video if you haven't. Regardless, thanks for sticking with me from here on out. And to everyone else, let's get into the very bottom of this iceberg. Excluding sidecar races, there have been 86 deaths in the history of Grand Prix motorcycle racing. Someone had to be the first, and that man was Ben Drinkwater. I have to say, fantastic last name. Drinkwater was a man of many talents, a railway signalman, motor engineer, and motorcycle dealer in the 30s and 40s. He competed in the Isle of Man TT and Manx Grand Prix from 1937 onward, particularly adept in the lightweight TT. He came third in 1947 and fourth in 1948. In 1949, he started the 350cc race, the very first round of the Grand Prix Racing World Championship ever held, and he would crash at the 11th mile marker. In his honor, the curve in which he died was named Drinkwater Bend. The 2010 San Marino Grand Prix. Shoya Tomizawa was a Japanese Moto2 rider who sadly passed away due to injuries sustained at the 2010 San Marino Grand Prix. Tomizawa started his full-time Grand Prix career in the last year of the 250cc class and saw less than great results. But he adapted incredibly well to the Moto2 class, winning the very first Moto2 race and putting up consistently good results for the first half of the season. In San Marino, he was running 4th in the race on lap 12 when he lost the rear end coming out of the Curvone corner. His bike fell in the middle of the straight, leaving him directly in the path of Scott Redding and Alex DeAngelis, who both struck the downed rider, causing trauma to his head and abdomen. Despite the rider's unconscious body still being on the track, the race was not stopped, which forced marshals to conduct a fast removal of Tomizawa and Redding, who also needed medical attention. In their haste, marshals also appeared to drop Tomizawa's stretcher in the gravel while trying to get him off the track. Replays of the incident were shown multiple times, with even the announcers literally saying, "We don't need to see this again." Tomizawa was taken to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead. The announcement of his death came at the end of the MotoGP race later that day. Flags were lowered to half-mast and the podium ceremony was conducted without champagne. In the days following the incident, numerous questions were raised about the handling of it, particularly why the race wasn't stopped and the handling of Tomizawa's stretcher. It is very reminiscent of the crash that took Daijiro Kato's life 7 years prior, and people wondered why more precautions hadn't been taken considering that incident. MotoGP's chief doctor, Claudio Macchio Godena, responded with, quote, "We don't wait for another problem or more. Many times it is very important to quickly have support. In this situation, if you remove quickly, in my opinion, you have more possibility. Also, the paramedics and doctors don't have motorbikes on the track. It is more quiet for them to work very well." Officials explained the race wasn't red flagged because the rest of the riders had passed the incident, and by the time the scene was cleared, there was no need for one. Alex Hoffman, reporting for the German broadcast, also reported that Tomizawa and Redding were both okay after the incident, something he alleged he had heard from Dorna themselves and had been told to say. It was reported that Paolo Giavagnoli launched an investigation into the incident, considering criminal charges, but as far as I can tell, nothing ever really came of this. I usually like to think that we've come a long way in terms of safety and handling of incidents like this since the pre-IRTA era, where race organizers could get away with whatever they want and rider safety wasn't a concern. But an incident like this happening so recently and so far into the modern era is disturbing on a lot of levels. It really does show that special care needs to be taken every single time an incident like this occurs, which I feel like nowadays in the past 5 years, it really is. It very much is like that. Ivan Palazzese. Ivan Palazzese was an Italian-born Venezuelan rider. He competed from 1977 to 1989 in the 125 and 250cc classes, and, while he was aged 15 years and 77 days, became the youngest rider ever to stand on a Grand Prix podium. He, of course, lied about his age to get into the race. A podium he would share with Angel Nieto and Anton Mang. If you ever find yourself in a category with those two, you probably did something right. Once he was 18, he joined the Grand Prix grid full-time, racing 125cc alongside fellow Venezuelan teammates Johnny Cecotto and Carlos Lovato. In 1982, he had his best season, securing a win and 2 second-place finishes. He would move to the 250cc class the following year and would never find the same success in the intermediates. He would bounce around between Yamaha teams and had a brief stint with Austrian manufacturer Rotax before he signed to Aprilia full-time for the 1989 season. Sadly, this would end in tragedy. At the 1989 German Grand Prix, Palazzese was falling behind Andreas Preining when Preining's bike seized, causing him to slow to a near stop. Palazzese would collide with Preining's bike, causing him to fly off and hit the ground, and while he was picking himself up off the track, was struck in the chest by Bruno Bonwheel and Fabio Barchita. Bonwheel suffered a broken arm and leg, and Barchita's spine was fractured in the crash. Virginio Ferrari would stop to attempt to help Palazzese off the track, and he was the first one to discover that Palazzese had died on impact. The race was not stopped until riders were almost entirely back around the track and ready to pass through the site of the accident again. According to the Glasgow Herald, officials even criticized riders for not slowing down after the deadly incident, even though they refused to stop the race. This was the last time a rider was confirmed dead on the track during a race. He was honored after his death with an erection of a monument in the city of his birth. Rupert Hollaus' 1954 championship. Rupert Hollaus was an Austrian Grand Prix racer who competed in the 125 and 250cc classes between 1952 and 1954. In 1954, he broke out and was competing for the title on the duckbill NSU machine in the 125 and 250 classes. Sadly, his breakout season would be his last, as he was killed in practice for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Hollaus had a perfect season up until that point, winning all 4 of the 125cc races held thus far, and he would go on to become the only rider in Grand Prix racing history to be crowned as world champion posthumously, as well as being the only Austrian world champion in history. In the modern day, he is remembered through a race held in Austria every year at the Red Bull Ring, aptly named the Rupert Hollaus race. (1983) British Grand Prix. The 1983 British Grand Prix at Silverstone saw the tragic deaths of 2 riders. On lap 5 of the Grand Prix, Irish rider Norman Brown Suzuki experienced a mechanical failure and began to slow entering Stowe Corner. Another rider was riding behind him and in front of Swiss rider Peter Huber. The unnamed rider swerved to avoid Brown at the last second, leaving no time for Huber to react. He struck the Irish rider, who was killed instantly. Huber sustained serious injuries and was airlifted to an Oxford hospital, where he was pronounced dead. In the aftermath of the incident, the race was not stopped immediately, and a yellow flag and red and orange oil on the track flag were shown instead. The riders themselves appear to be the ones who stopped the race here, slowing to touring speeds with Barry Sheene seen gesturing to the race officials as if to ask, "Why the hell aren't you stopping this?" The race would be restarted after the debris was cleared and Huber was taken to the hospital. 1993 Spanish Grand Prix. One of the darkest days in Grand Prix motorcycle racing history came at the Spanish Grand Prix in 1993. Most of the time, when a rider dies in an accident, it's racing on the track. At the very least, they understand that on the track, they are risking their lives. Very rarely do we see an accident as preventable as this one was. A fan, who in some reports is listed as a friend of rider Loris Reggiani's, made his way into the pit lane at the Spanish Grand Prix without permission. Not knowing the pit lane procedure, he wandered into the path of Japanese 250cc rider Nobuyuki Wakai, who collided with the fan, sending him flying off the bike and hitting his head against the wall. He passed away from his injuries on the way to the hospital. The actual speed Wakai was traveling varies by account, with MotoE online putting it at 100 kilometers an hour, while an eyewitness account from Hervé Poncharal, who was the head of the Tech 3 garage that Wakai used, puts it more at 60 to 70 kilometers an hour. Wakai had shown potential in the 125cc class, and the 1993 season was his first year as a full-time intermediate rider. Regardless, such a preventable and unusual tragedy sticks out even in the deadly sport of motorcycle racing, and pit lane security today is now much tighter than it used to be, in no small part because of this moment. The death of Kim Newcombe. Kim Newcombe's death is another particularly tragic one in racing history because of how easily it could have been prevented, and the way in which he basically predicted it would happen. Newcombe was a talented New Zealander who had made Germany his second home, and had worked closely with his friend Dieter Koenig to create the Koenig Grand Prix racing motorcycle. He saw great success with the machine, securing 3rd in his first ever Grand Prix in 1972 and competing full-time on the grid in 1973. He was mounting a championship challenge against Phil Reed, securing a win at the Yugoslavian Grand Prix that year and being second in the points behind Phil Reed. Between races, he was invited to come out and compete in a non-championship event at Silverstone, a track which wouldn't be on the Grand Prix calendar for another 4 years. And as such, Newcombe was unfamiliar with the track. Upon his arrival at the venue, Newcombe walked around the unfamiliar track, and noted a particularly dangerous section at Stowe Corner. He went to the clerk of the course, a man named Vernon Cooper, and explained to him that Stowe Corner had a dip, and if you caught it at the wrong angle, it could send you directly into a wall, potentially spelling disaster. He asked that some hay bales be put in to counteract this possibility. Cooper refused to do so, and was reportedly so infuriated by the suggestion, he angrily told Newcombe he would be banned from the race if he dared to complain again. The next day, during the race, Newcombe was on fire. For the first 6 laps, he led the race comfortably, beating out the hometown riders on the bike he had helped create. However, soon enough, the very thing that he had warned Cooper about came to pass. He hit the dip in Stowe Corner the wrong way, sending him off the track, where he high-sided and was sent into the wall, where his bike would follow him and make contact. The loudspeaker announced Newcombe was down but okay. This wasn't true. Newcombe's wife rushed to the medical tent, where Newcombe was unconscious. The doctor there said he was fine, nothing broken, but there was clearly something wrong. The doctor refused to listen to Newcombe's wife and friend, who called an ambulance, and it took 4 hours in total for him to be seen by an actual doctor. Later that day, Vernon Cooper put some hay bales in Stoke Corner. Newcombe was treated for brain bleeding but never regained consciousness. He was declared brain dead 3 days later and was taken off life support. Newcombe's full story is told in the documentary, which you can get for like $3 or $4 from Duke Video. I highly recommend it. It's very well made. This, like many other incidents in the 70s and 80s, is just another race organizer who refused to put in any effort for rider safety. It is truly tragic that so many riders had to die in order to get to the safety standards we have today. And on that sobering note, we've reached the end of the video. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end. Please drop a like, subscribe if you want more content like this, and if you want to be super cool and help support the channel even more, be like channel member MBP2112 and join the channel. If you're driving right now, be careful when you're queuing up the next video, and have a fantastic day.